They thought the Hollow Kids were gone forever, just names fading in dusty files. But when Rex barked at an abandoned truck, he tore open a case that no one else dared to touch. The highway stretched out empty and silent, the last light of the sun staining the sky with a tired, orange glow. Deputy Claire Monroe pulled her cruiser onto the shoulder, her headlights catching the battered outline of a truck parked beneath the overpass. The call had been routine, just another abandoned vehicle to clear from the books, but something about the way the truck leaned into the ditch made her uneasy. She killed the engine, the hum fading into stillness, and reached for the door. Rex was already waiting, muscles tight, amber eyes sharp as the night settled in around them. The German shepherd leapt down first, landing with a low growl rumbling from his chest. His ears flicked toward the truck, his nose quivering as he tested the air. Claire adjusted her belt, resting one hand on the flashlight clipped at her side, and followed him across the gravel. Her boots crunched against the loose stones, echoing louder than she wanted in the emptiness. The truck loomed larger with each step, its paint flaked away by years of neglect, windows dark and smeared with dirt. She muttered softly, more to herself than to Rex, "Looks like it's been sitting here a while." But Rex didn't relax. His tail was stiff, his shoulders set, as if he were facing an enemy he couldn't yet see. He circled the truck once, nose pressed close to the rusted metal, then froze at the tailgate. A sharp bark split the stillness, loud and urgent, a sound that carried the weight of command. Claire's pulse jumped. She had learned long ago to trust that bark. "Easy, boy," she said. But her own voice trembled. She reached forward, laying her hand against the rough metal of the tailgate. It was cool beneath her palm, colder than it should have been after a long day. Rex barked again, pawing at the seam where the gate met the frame, his claws scraping against rust. Claire flicked her flashlight on and swung the beam inside. At first, she saw nothing but broken boards, tangled ropes, and the dust of abandonment. Then the light caught something pale, something small wedged tight against the corner. She leaned closer, her breath catching. It was a shoe, a child's shoe, dirt, caked and frayed at the seams, the faded blue canvas worn nearly white. She reached for it with gloved hands, tugging it free from the rusted bed. The sight of it in her palm turned her stomach to ice. It wasn't just a shoe lost on the side of the road. She knew its size, its weight, the way it belonged to someone no more than 7 or 8 years old. Rex let out a low whine, his nose pressing against her arm as if urging her to understand. Claire swallowed hard, the silence of the highway pressing down on her. This wasn't just an abandoned truck. It was a grave marker, a warning, a cry for help left behind in steel and rust. She felt the air go cold around her, the shadows stretching longer, as if the world itself knew the truth. Something terrible had passed this way, and Rex had just found the first clue. Claire drove back to the station, with her knuckles white on the steering wheel, the little shoe sealed in an evidence bag resting on the passenger seat beside Rex. The German shepherd sat upright, his eyes never leaving the bag, his breath fogging the window as if even he knew the weight of what they carried. Claire kept her speed steady, not because she wanted to, but because her training told her not to disturb evidence. Her heart wanted to floor it, to push the cruiser until the engine screamed, but she forced herself to stay calm. The highway lights flashed across her windshield, each one marking another thought that she didn't want to face. By the time she pulled into the sheriff's office, the sky was fully dark. The station buzzed with the ordinary rhythm of late shifts, phones ringing, deputies filing reports, coffee brewing in the corner. Claire walked past all of it without a word, her boots heavy on the tile floor. Rex at her side. She moved straight to the evidence desk and slid the bag across the counter. "Where'd you get this?" the clerk asked, lifting it with gloved hands. "Abandoned truck out by the overpass," Claire said, her voice clipped. "Run it against the missing cases. I want answers tonight." The clerk gave her a look but didn't argue. The shoe disappeared into the back, and Claire leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. Rex settled at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his ears stayed sharp. He was waiting. just as she was. Minutes stretched into an hour before the clerk returned, a file tucked under his arm, his expression grim. He set the file down and opened it. A photograph slid across the counter. A smiling boy, with a mop of brown hair, holding a baseball glove too big for his hand. Matthew Coulter, the clerk said quietly. Age 9. Vanished walking home from practice 7 years ago. We compared the shoe to the one he was wearing when he disappeared. It's a match. Claire stared at the photo, her stomach twisting. She remembered the case, even though she hadn't been working then. Everyone remembered. 18 children gone over the years, from parks, from sidewalks, from front yards. Always one by one, always without a trace. The files had piled up like bones, never connected by the people who should have seen the lines. People called them the Hollow Kids, a name that grew like mold in the dark corners of the town. Most folks whispered that the kids were dead, their names nothing more than ghost stories to scare others into holding their children close. The cases had grown cold, buried under new crimes and new tragedies. But now, Claire thought, now Rex had found something that tied them all back together. She looked down at her partner. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, as if telling her not to doubt. His bark out on that highway had not been noise. It had been the spark that shook loose a truth buried too long. The Hollow Kids were not gone. Not yet. Long before Rex rode in the passenger seat of Claire's cruiser, he had been bred for war. His first memories filled with commands, barked in clipped tones, the smell of dust and gun oil and the constant thrum of helicopters overhead. He was barely a year old when handlers strapped on his first vest and led him into the heat of a desert that seemed to stretch forever. He learned to sniff out danger in the sand, learned to stand still when gunfire cracked above his head, learned that his job was to protect the men and women who trusted him with their lives. Rex bore it all without hesitation. But war leaves marks that training cannot erase. One night, an explosion ripped through a convoy, and Rex was thrown across the dirt shrapnel, tearing his side. He got back up bleeding but unbroken and dragged his handler away from the fire. That handler survived only because of him, yet the blast changed Rex forever. His ear was split at the tip, his flank carried scars like claw marks across leather, and worse than the wounds was the way his eyes darkened after that night. When the deployment ended, Rex returned to a kennel lined with dogs who had seen the same things. He was restless, snapping at shadows, pacing until his paws bled. Trainers whispered that he was no longer fit, that the war had taken too much from him. They marked his file with words that might as well have been a sentence. Aggression, anxiety, retire early. He would have been shipped off to a quiet end in a shelter, forgotten by the system that once depended on him. But then came Claire Monroe. She had seen his record, the warnings, the notes about him being too unpredictable. She saw the scars in the photos, the torn ear, the hard eyes, and something in her refused to look away. She was no stranger to people. Calling others broken, she knew what it meant to carry pain without choice. So she asked for Rex, not because he was perfect, but because he had been through fire and was still standing. She didn't want a dog that had never been tested. She wanted one who had survived. The first time to its Rand EY met, Rex didn't bark. He only watched her from the corner of the kennel, his head low, his tail stiff. She knelt on the concrete floor, ignoring the smell of bleach and fur, and spoke softly, not orders, but words of patience. She let him come to. Leave her in his own time. When at last he placed his nose against her hand, she whispered, "You're not finished yet." From that day, Rex never left her side. He trained with her, worked cases with her, and though his scars never faded, his purpose sharpened. He was no longer just a soldier turned cast-off. He was a partner. He was a protector. He was a warrior who he had been given a second chance. And in every call, every search, every mission, since he had refused to fail again. The evidence room felt colder than the rest of the station as Claire stood over the shoe laid out under harsh fluorescent light. Forensics had been running tests all morning, and now the techs were ready to talk. They pointed out the residue caught in the seams of the worn canvas, bits of earth, and a slick of oil that didn't match the truck or the stretch of highway where it was found. The soil was darker, heavy with clay, mixed with traces of motor grease that carried a chemical bite. It told a story the truck could not. The shoe had been somewhere else before it was dropped into that rusted bed. Claire's mind raced as she took in the report. If the shoe had been planted, then whoever left it wanted it to be found, or at least didn't care if it was. That meant a mistake. The first mistake in years. She folded the report under her arm and headed outside where Rex waited, his ears flicking as if he had been listening through the walls the entire time. "All right, partner," she said, unclipping his lead. "Show me what I'm missing." They drove back to the overpass where the truck still sat under impound lights. The night air smelled of rain and iron, and the ground was soft with mud from the storm that had rolled through hours earlier. Rex leapt down from the cruiser, nose to the ground instantly, his body tense with focus. He circled the truck only once before pulling away, his leash snapping taut as he dragged Claire toward the ditch a few yards off the shoulder. The drainage ditch was choked with weeds and trash, water pooling in shallow places that reflected the pale glow of the moon. Rex bounded down the slope, ignoring the mud that clung to his legs, and began pawing at a mound of debris. Claire followed, flashlight beam bouncing over the tangled mess. At first, she saw nothing but sticks and wrappers. Then the glint of plastic caught the light. Rex dug harder, dirt flying behind him until the shape came free. Claire crouched down and pulled it from the mud, a sheet of clear plastic wrap twisted and stained with dark smears. Her throat tightened as she set it aside, only for Rex to start again, his claws raking the earth as if he knew there was more. Soon he uncovered a strip of silver duct tape crumpled and stiff, the adhesive side clotted with hair too fine to be animal. Claire felt her stomach drop. "Good boy," she whispered, though her voice was hollow. She bagged the tape quickly, her hands trembling even in the gloves. Rex wasn't finished. He pushed his muzzle deeper into the soil, growling low until he dragged out a rag drenched in an acrid chemical smell that burned Claire's nose even from a distance. She recognized the scent instantly, an industrial cleaner sometimes used to wipe down surfaces, the kind strong enough to erase fingerprints, strong enough to hide a crime. She sealed the rag in another bag and stood, staring at the collection of items lined up on the grass. It wasn't speculation anymore. No ghost stories whispered about the hollow kids to fill silence in the town. These were real objects, touched by real hands, carrying the weight of something monstrous. Claire looked down at Rex, who sat now, his chest rising and falling, eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that chilled her. He had dragged the first thread into the light, and she knew in her bones that if they followed it, they would find the rest. The case wasn't cold anymore. It was waking up, and Rex had just opened the door. The sheriff's office had gone quiet by the time Claire spread the files across the evidence board. The hum of the vending machine in the hallway was the only sound, steady and low, while Rex stretched out on the floor beside her desk, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving her. One by one, she pinned the photographs, each one a child smiling in the captured innocence of another time. Matthew Coulter with his oversized baseball glove, Ellie Hargrove with her front teeth missing, twins Sam and Sarah Beckett holding hands at a county fair. 18 faces in all, each with dates written beneath them, each torn from their families without explanation. Claire stood back, arms folded tight, trying to steady herself against the weight of the wall. For years these cases had been scattered, each boxed up and labeled cold, no clear thread binding them. But the shoe Rex found had changed everything. She took a red marker and began to draw lines between the locations where each child had vanished. A park, a sidewalk, a schoolyard, a grocery store. At first, the lines looked random, a spiderweb tangled without reason. But as more marks appeared, a shape began to form. She leaned closer, tracing the lines with her finger. They bent and curved, and at the center of it all was a stretch of county land few bothered to drive anymore. Decades ago, it had been the spine of trucking routes that hauled goods in and out of Hollow Creek. But the road had long since fallen into decay. Bridges were left to rot, way stations boarded shut, warehouses collapsed into themselves. People avoided the place, saying it felt cursed, though no one ever said why. Now, Claire could see why. Every missing child circled back to those forgotten roads, like spokes to a wheel. Her chest tightened as the realization sank in. Whoever was behind the Hollow Kids had been using the dead trucking routes as cover. Vehicles could disappear for hours out there without question. Sound carried strangely, and no one went looking. The map didn't just show patterns. It showed intention. Someone working with precision year after year, leaving behind only whispers. Rex lifted his head, watching her as if sensing her thoughts. His tail thumped once against the floor, not in joy, but in acknowledgement. He had dragged her here, to this place where the truth finally began to take shape. Claire crouched beside him, running her hand along the scar at his flank. "You knew," she murmured. He pressed his nose to her wrist, warm and steady. And she drew strength from the simple gesture. She turned back to the board and pinned the rag, the duct tape, and the plastic wrap beneath the photos. Together they painted a grim picture. But for the first time in years, there was direction, there was a path forward. She stepped back again, the weight of the silence pressing on her, and whispered to herself more than to anyone else. They were taken into the shadows, and now we're going to bring them out. Rex stood, ears forward, body ready. To him it wasn't just a promise. It was a command already set in motion. The night smelled of rain and gasoline, as Claire followed Rex along the edge of the forgotten road. The rag sealed in evidence had carried a strange chemical bite, and when Rex caught the scent again outside town, his whole body changed. He pulled hard against the leash, ears forward, nose low to the ground, as if every step carried him closer to something he had always known was there. Claire kept pace, her flashlight sweeping over weeds that cracked through the old asphalt, her hand resting near her holster. Rex led her to a sagging auto shop at the end of the road, its windows shattered, the roof patched with rusted tin sheets that rattled in the wind. The place had been closed for years, dust and silence keeping it company. But Rex stiffened at the door, his hackles lifted, a growl rolling deep in his chest. Claire's pulse quickened. She pressed her shoulder against the frame and pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside smelled of mildew and old oil, the air heavy, the shadows thicker than they should have been. Rex's nose twitched as he moved forward, his paws soundless against the concrete. Claire swept the light across broken shelves, scattered tools, a row of dented lockers, and then stopped. There was movement, faint, in the corner near a collapsed workbench. She drew in a breath and raised the beam. A girl sat curled against the wall, knees to her chest, arms wrapped tight around them, as though holding herself together was the only thing keeping her alive. Her face was pale, her hair knotted, her clothes nothing more than rags. She blinked against the sudden light, lifting a trembling hand, as if to ward it off. Claire dropped to one knee, voice low and steady. "It's all right. You're safe now. My name's Claire. This is Rex." The German shepherd padded closer, his body low, his movements gentle. He didn't bark. He simply lowered his head until his nose brushed the girl's fingers. She flinched, then froze, then slowly let her hand rest against his scarred muzzle. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, her voice broken and dry. "I knew someone would come." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. "What's your name?" "Lily," she said, her lips trembling. "Lily Carr." The name hit like a strike to the chest. Lily Carr had vanished 3 years ago, walking home from summer camp. Her photo, one of the many on the wall of the Hollow Kids. Everyone had believed she was gone forever, but here she was, gaunt, terrified, alive. Claire shrugged off her jacket and wrapped it around Lily's thin shoulders. The girl clung to it like armor. Her voice shook as she began to speak, halting, afraid of the words. "They kept us in cages, Metal cages. We weren't allowed to talk. At night, men came with flashlights. Sometimes they took kids away. There was a red truck. Always the red truck. That's how they disappeared. Claire's blood ran cold. She looked at Rex, who held his place at Lily's side. His eyes locked on her, as if daring her to ignore the truth. The rag had brought them here, but Rex had brought them to the first survivor. The case was no longer a story of whispers. It was real. And now it had a voice. The next morning, the sheriff's office buzzed in a way Claire had never seen before. The discovery of Lily Carr had shaken the whole county, and for the first time in years, the Hollow kids weren't just a collection of cold files buried in cabinets. They were breathing again, carried on the fragile words of a survivor and the relentless instincts of a scarred German shepherd. Claire sat at the briefing table with Lily resting in a nearby office, under the care of medics, Rex lying at her boots, when the door swung open and a tall man in a dark suit entered. He carried himself like someone who had walked into dozens of small-town stations before, his coat still damp from the rain, his face lined from years of seeing too much. He set a folder on the table and introduced himself with a clipped tone. "Agent Daniel Briggs, FBI. I've been tracking cases like this for a long time. Now it looks like they've landed on your doorstep." The sheriff gestured for him to continue. Claire leaned forward, her pen poised, though her chest already felt tight. Briggs opened the folder and laid out documents, pages thick with print, photographs of trucks, warehouses, and grainy surveillance stills. "These children," he said, tapping the photos pinned on the wall behind them, "were not taken at random. This is not one man, not a lone predator. It's a network. Organized, deliberate, and careful. They operate in plain sight, using the cracks of the system to stay invisible. Each time a child went missing, paperwork followed, school transfer forms, forged medical records, false guardianship claims. On paper, those kids never vanished. They were erased." Claire felt her stomach turn as she thought of Matthew Coulter's empty baseball glove, Ellie Hargrove's toothless grin, Lily Carr's trembling voice. "And no one caught it?" she asked. Briggs shook his head. Each case was too spread out, too clean. Local departments saw only what they were meant to see. But together, the pattern becomes clear. The Hollow Network has been operating for at least a decade, maybe longer. They move children like cargo, and they do it with discipline. Rex let out a low growl, his eyes flicking toward the evidence board, where the red lines cut across the county map. Briggs followed his gaze and nodded. "The truck you found wasn't just abandoned, it was transport. We've linked red freight trucks to disappearances in 3 other states. They blend in, never raising suspicion. But that shoe Rex uncovered, that was their mistake." The room fell quiet, the weight of Briggs's words settling heavy. Claire reached down and stroked Rex's fur, steadying herself. "So what do we do?" she asked finally. Briggs leaned forward, his voice hard as steel. "We hunt them the way they've hunted these kids, piece by piece, root by root, until there's nowhere left for them to hide. They're muskisms." Claire looked at Rex, who lifted his head, his ears pricked, his body alert as if he understood every word. He had dragged her from silence into truth, and now the fight was bigger than the town, bigger than any one case. The Hollow Network was real, and Rex was already leading the charge against it. The survivors' words spread through the task force like fire. A red truck, cages, men with flashlights, and routes that led into the forgotten trucking roads. Every agent in the room leaned over maps and files, desperate to find the break that would bring the Hollow Network into the light. But while humans argued over theories and lines, Rex never took his eyes off Lily Carr. The girl sat wrapped in a blanket, her hands trembling, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't said much more since the first night, her body exhausted, but she kept touching the filthy jacket she had been found in, as if it carried something she couldn't let go of. Claire knelt beside her, speaking gently. "Lily, we'll keep you safe. Do you think you can tell us anything else?" Lily's eyes flicked toward Rex instead of Claire. The dog sat close, ears forward, watching her with the same steady calm that had coaxed her trust in the old auto shop. She lifted the jacket hesitantly, almost as though offering it to him. Rex leaned forward and sniffed, his nose brushing the folds. Then he stiffened. The growl started deep in his chest, low and dangerous, nothing like the warning barks he gave at the station door. Claire felt the vibration before she heard the sound, her hand instinctively tightening on his collar. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, though she knew already he had found something. Rex pawed at the jacket, claws raking the worn fabric, until they caught on a patch near the inside seam. He dug harder, the sound of tearing cloth filling the quiet room. Claire helped him, peeling back the lining. Beneath it, hidden under layers of filth, was a rusted plate no bigger than a credit card sewn flat against the fabric. Claire frowned, sliding it free. It wasn't just metal. Stamped into the surface was a logo, faded but clear enough under the light. A circle wrapped around the letters HFC, flanked by the outline of a truck cab. Briggs leaned in sharply. "Hollow Freight Company," he muttered. "That outfit closed 15 years ago, after a string of bankruptcies and safety violations. Their depots are scattered all across this county. Most are abandoned now." Claire felt her breath catch. Abandoned trucking depots, just like the routes on the map. Rex's growl deepened, his eyes locked on the plate, as though daring anyone to dismiss it. Claire stroked his head, understanding the message. He had found what everyone else had missed. Briggs straightened, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "This is it. They've been using the old hollow freight depots as cover, moving kids in and out under the shell of a company no one questions anymore. No one ever looked twice at a red freight truck on those roads, because they belonged there once." Lily clutched the blanket tighter, her lips trembling. "That's it," she whispered, her eyes darting to the stamp. "The men, their jackets had that too. I remember." The room went silent, except for Rex's steady breathing. Claire looked down at him, pride swelling in her chest. He hadn't let go of the trail. Not once. While humans missed the clue hidden in plain sight, Rex had dug it out of shadows and rust. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was leading. The quarry sat like a scar on the edge of Hollow Creek, its cliffs jagged and raw against the night sky. Old signs warned trespassers to keep out, their paint long faded, their warnings ignored by the weeds growing high around the gates. Claire parked at the edge of the access road, her headlights sweeping across broken fences and rusted machinery that hadn't moved in years. The air smelled of damp stone and rust, heavy with silence. Behind her, the FBI vans lined up, their engines ticking as they cooled. Agents moved quietly, their gear heavy, their radios whispering. Rex jumped down from the cruiser before she could even call. Nose to the ground, tail stiff with purpose. Claire clipped the lead onto his vest, but she knew she would only be following. Rex pulled her toward the mouth of the quarry, claws scraping against the gravel, his body tense and ready. The map pulled from the freight company records had marked this place, one of several depots hidden along the old trucking routes. Briggs had explained the paperwork, the property changes, the shell companies that disguised ownership, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the way Rex's ears locked forward and his steps carried him straight into the shadows. They descended into the quarry, their flashlights bouncing off stone walls, the crunch of boots echoing like whispers in a cathedral. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the air thick with moisture and something sharper, something that made Claire's throat tighten. Rex stopped at the edge of a collapsed tunnel and sniffed the ground, then swung sharply to the left, pulling her into a narrow passage she would have missed without him. The tunnel wound downward, a black throat carved into the earth. At times the ceiling dipped low, forcing Claire to crouch, while Rex moved sure-footed, his shoulders brushing stone. His hackles were raised, a warning written across his body. Then he froze, nose pressed to a seam in the wall. His bark ripped through the dark, echoing again and again, each one sharper than the last. Claire raised her light, The beam caught the outline of steel buried behind the rock. A heavy door bolted shut, its surface scarred by time. She shouted for the agents, and within moments they were at her side, tools and crowbars in hand. Rex didn't stop barking, his paws scratching against the steel as if trying to tear it down himself. The sound cut into every person's chest, a command none could ignore. The agents pried at the hinges, sparks flying as metal screamed against metal. At last the door groaned and swung open. The smell hit first, a mix of rust, mildew, and something fouler, something human. Flashlights pierced the dark, and the sight made the room fall silent. Cages lined the walls, small and cruel, their bars streaked with rust, their locks snapped open or hanging loose. Chains lay in piles, their links stained. Scattered across the floor were scraps of clothing, tiny shoes, torn shirts, a doll with its face rubbed away. Claire felt her knees weaken. This was no myth, no whisper from old files. This was proof. Rex stepped inside first, his nose brushing the remnants, his body trembling with restrained fury. He looked back at Claire, his eyes lit by the flashlight's beam, and in them she saw the truth that none of them wanted to admit. Children had been here. They had been kept like animals in the dark, and the hollow network had walked away believing no one would ever find their traces. But Rex had, and now the world would have to see. The air inside the quarry tunnels grew heavier the deeper they went. The beams of flashlights cut across dripping stone and jagged walls, but it was Rex who led the way, his nose low, his body vibrating with urgency. Every few yards he barked, sharp and echoing, the sound bouncing off the walls until it felt like the earth itself was warning them of what lay ahead. Claire gripped his lead, but in truth she was being pulled, her boots sliding across grit as she tried to match his speed. Behind them the FBI teams moved in silence, their weapons ready, their radios hissing with clipped orders. Rex stopped suddenly at a split in the passage, his nose pressed against the ground. He barked once, then swung left, dragging Claire toward a section of rock that looked unremarkable at first glance. But when the light swept across it, she saw faint marks on the stone, grooves from machinery, and the outline of another door disguised in the wall. Rex pawed at it, his bark exploding in the confined space like a war drum. The sound pushed adrenaline through every vein. Briggs gave the signal. Explosives were placed, the countdown started, and Claire wrapped her arms around Rex's neck until the blast shook the tunnel. The steel door blew inward, dust and smoke rushing out like a released secret. They surged forward. Rex slipped from her grip and raced ahead through the smoke. His barking guided them as they stormed the bunker. What they found made the breath leave Claire's chest. Against the far wall, huddled together in thin blankets, were children. Several of them, faces pale, eyes wide with terror but alive. Some clutched one another, others stared blankly as though afraid to believe rescue had come. Claire's voice cracked as she shouted for medics, her heart breaking at the sight. The hollow kids weren't just names on files anymore. They were here. Then the gunfire erupted. From the shadows, armed guards opened fire, the tunnel flashing with bursts of light. Agents dove for cover, returning shots that rang through the cavern. Claire threw herself against the wall, her hand shielding her head, her eyes on the children who screamed and cowered against the floor. And in that chaos, Rex did not hesitate. He launched himself into the storm of noise, his body a blur of fur and muscle, jaws locking onto the wrist of a guard, raising his rifle toward the children. The man screamed as Rex dragged him down, the gun clattering across the concrete. The shepherd held fast, his teeth sunk deep, his growl carrying more power than any bullet. The fight raged for minutes that felt like hours, but the agents pressed forward, clearing the bunker one room at a time. At last the gunfire died, the echoes fading into silence. Claire stumbled to her feet, heart pounding, and ran toward Rex. He released the guard only when the man was cuffed, then turned to Claire, his muzzle wet, his chest heaving. His eyes burned with the same fierce certainty that had carried them here from the very first bark. The bunker was theirs now. The children were safe. And Rex had once again stood between darkness and the innocent, proving with every scar and every breath that he would never stop fighting. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the kind of smell that clings to buildings where too many lives have been decided. Months had passed since the raid in the quarry, but the weight of it had never left. The children who had been pulled from the bunker were slowly healing, their eyes no longer hollow, their voices starting to return, but scars lingered. The ringleader, Thomas Vance, had been dragged out in cuffs, his empire of lies collapsing around him, and now he stood at the defense table with a blank face, dressed in a suit that did not disguise the rot beneath. The benches were packed so full that people stood against the walls. Parents of the missing, some clutching framed photos pressed to their chests like shields, others holding onto the hands of the survivors who had made it out alive. Claire sat near the front with Rex at her feet, his body still healing, his side wrapped where the bullet had grazed him during the raid. The bandage peeked out from beneath his vest, but his head was high, his amber eyes locked on the man who had tried to bury the truth in stone and steel. The prosecution laid out the case in a voice that carried through the hushed room. Photographs were shown, financial records laid bare, testimony read aloud. But it was the survivors who carried the trial. Lily Carr took the stand first, her voice trembling at the start, but growing stronger with every sentence. She spoke of cages, of the red truck, of the nights when flashlights swept across the bunker and children disappeared. Others followed, their stories different in detail but identical in terror, their bravery filling the courtroom with something heavier than evidence. It was truth spoken into air that had once been thick with silence. Claire rested her hand on Rex's head as each child spoke. She remembered how he had dug for the rag, how he had torn through the shadows, how he had thrown himself against a gunman to save lives. None of this would have been possible without him. Every face in the room, every voice that dared speak, owed its chance at justice to a dog who refused to give up. When the jury returned, the room held its breath. The foreman's voice did not waver as he spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Then the stillness shattered. Parents cried out, some collapsing into each other's arms, some clutching their children with a desperation born of years of loss. The survivors wept, not only from pain but from relief, their chains broken at last. Photographs were held high, no longer symbols of graves but of lives reclaimed. Claire exhaled a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She leaned down to Rex, pressing her forehead against his scarred muzzle. "We did it," she whispered. His tail thumped once against the floor, a quiet acknowledgement that for him it had never been a question. He had done his duty. He had brought them here. The morning was bright and clear, the kind of day that felt almost too gentle for what it was meant to hold. The courthouse trial was behind them, the ringleader locked away with no chance of return, but the scars of the hollow kids remained. Some families had been given back their children, thin and shaken but alive. Others carried only memories and photographs, their arms forever empty. Hollow Creek had decided that silence would no longer define them. The town gathered in front of the sheriff's office, the crowd spilling across the steps and onto the street. Children clutched flowers, parents held each other, and reporters lined the edges with their cameras, though for once they seemed subdued. At the center stood a veiled monument draped in dark cloth. Claire rested one hand on Rex's vest as she waited with the others. The German shepherd sat tall, despite the limp that lingered in his back leg, his head steady, his ears twitching at every sound. His scars caught the sunlight like faint silver lines, proof of battles fought and survived. Children pointed at him from the crowd, whispering his name like he was more legend than flesh. But Rex only sat still, watching the moment as if he understood the weight of it. The mayor stepped forward, his voice carrying across the gathered town. He spoke of loss, of courage, of children stolen and children returned. He spoke of families who had endured the unbearable, and of a community that had chosen to face its shadows instead of hiding from them. Then he spoke of Rex. He told how a dog had barked at an abandoned truck, how he had dug in the dirt when no one else would, how he had pulled them into the heart of darkness and stood between children and gunfire. His voice faltered, and for a moment he had to pause, but the silence said more than words ever could. When the cloth was pulled away, the crowd drew in a collective breath. The bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight, mounted on stone, the words etched deep so they could never be erased. In honor of Rex, who refused to let silence bury the truth. Beneath the plaque was a simple carving of a shepherd's head, ears pricked, eyes steady, a symbol of loyalty and courage that would outlast them all. Claire knelt beside Rex, her knees pressing against the stone steps, and leaned her forehead against his. For a long moment, she said nothing. The hum of voices, the shuffling of the crowd, even the cry of a child faded until all she could feel was the warm steadiness of the dog who had carried her through every shadow. Her voice cracked when she finally whispered, "You saved them. You saved all of us." Rex gave a quiet grunt, almost a sigh, and lowered his head against her shoulder. His tail thumped once, slow and final, as though he was allowing himself, just for that moment, to rest. For the first time in years, Hollow Creek felt safe. Parents held their children without fear. Laughter rang out in the square, and the weight of unanswered questions had finally been lifted. It was not because justice had been served, though that mattered. It was not because the guilty were gone, though that gave peace. It was because a dog refused to stop barking, and in his voice the truth had finally been heard. Thank you for watching this video of a dog's devotion. If you liked this story, show your support with a like, and join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.